November 25, 1943. 06:42 hours. North Atlantic, 280 miles southwest of Iceland. Chief Petty Officer William Bill Henderson felt the deck of USS Wakefield, DE 412, heave upward beneath his feet as a German Type 60C U-boat's torpedo struck the destroyer escort's starboard side amidships. The explosion killed the lights in the galley where Henderson had been preparing Thanksgiving dinner for 340 men. In the darkness, he heard water rushing into the ship through a 12-foot gash in the hull. The Wakefield began listing 8 degrees to starboard. Damage control teams reported the ship was taking on 400 gallons per minute. At that rate, they had maybe 6 hours before she went down. Standard Navy procedure said abandon ship preparations. Every man to his emergency station. Seal the damaged compartments. Prepare lifeboats. Wait for rescue that might never come in U-boat-infested waters, where the November Atlantic temperature was 38 degrees. Cold enough to kill a man in 20 minutes. Henderson looked at the 18 turkeys he'd been brining for 3 days, at the sweet potatoes he'd requisitioned from supply stores back in Norfolk, at the cranberry sauce made from dried cranberries he'd been hoarding since October, at the pumpkin pies cooling on the mess deck. He made a decision that would define what leadership meant aboard a dying ship. "Light the backup galley stoves," he told his cooks. "We're serving Thanksgiving dinner at 1200 hours, on time, like we planned." Every damage control manual said, focus all hands on saving the ship. Every emergency procedure said, non-essential activities cease during crisis. The Wakefield's executive officer, when he heard what Henderson planned, called it insane, called it a distraction from critical repair work, called it a waste of resources when men should be pumping water and welding steel. They were all wrong. William Henderson grew up in South Boston, Massachusetts, where his mother ran a boarding house for merchant sailors during the Depression. She fed 40 men every night on a budget that barely covered flour and potatoes. Henderson learned to cook at age 12, standing on a milk crate to reach the stove, stretching ingredients further than seemed possible. Feeding people wasn't just work, it was survival. It was dignity. It was the difference between despair and hope when everything else had failed. He enlisted in the Navy in 1938, age 19, and immediately requested assignment to culinary services. His recruiter had laughed. Everyone wanted gunnery or navigation, something with glory attached. But Henderson understood something about ships that most sailors missed. Morale started in the galley. A crew that ate well fought well. A crew that felt cared for didn't break under pressure. By 1943, Henderson was chief petty officer aboard the Wakefield, a newly commissioned destroyer escort assigned to convoy protection in the North Atlantic. The ship was small, 306 feet, 1,400 tons, built fast and cheap at the Boston Navy Yard specifically to counter the U-boat threat. She carried 3 3-inch guns, depth charge racks, and a crew that averaged 22 years old. Most had never seen combat. Most had never seen the Atlantic in November, when waves hit 40 feet and ice formed on the railings faster than men could chip it off. The Wakefield had joined convoy HX-265 on November 20th, escorting 37 merchant ships from New York to Liverpool. The convoy crawled at 7 knots, the speed of the slowest freighter, which made them perfect targets for wolf packs. German U-boats operated in groups of 8 to 12 submarines, coordinating attacks that overwhelmed convoy defenses. In the first 3 weeks of November 1943, U-boats had sunk 21 Allied merchant ships in the North Atlantic. Another 48 sailors had died in the freezing water, bodies never recovered. Henderson knew these statistics because he talked to survivors when they came aboard for medical treatment. He'd served them coffee and soup while they trembled in blankets, telling stories about watching their ships go down in 4 minutes. about swimming through burning oil, about watching friends disappear beneath the surface because there weren't enough lifeboats. He'd started planning the Thanksgiving meal in October, requisitioning supplies through official channels and unofficial trades with other ships. Turkey was nearly impossible. Most convoys ate canned hash and hardtack, but Henderson had connections. He knew a supply sergeant at Norfolk who owed him a favor from poker games. He knew a merchant captain who'd trade poultry for Henderson's famous apple pie recipe. By the time Wakefield sailed on November 20th, Henderson had 18 frozen turkeys, 40 pounds of sweet potatoes, 30 pounds of cranberries, and enough flour and sugar for 20 pumpkin pies. The crew had been talking about it for days. Thanksgiving aboard ship, real turkey instead of Spam, pumpkin pie instead of canned fruit. It was something to look forward to when everything else about convoy duty was miserable. The cold, the exhaustion, the constant threat of torpedoes in the night. And now, at 06:42 hours on November 25th, Henderson stood in a galley tilted 8 degrees, water rushing into the ship 40 feet away, and made his choice. The torpedo had struck at the worst possible time, dawn, when visibility was poor but improving, when U-boats liked to attack because convoy escorts were changing watch and crews were tired from night duty. The explosion killed 3 men instantly in the forward engine room. Machinist mate second class Robert Morrison, age 23 from Detroit, who'd been monitoring fuel pressure. Fireman first class Anthony Delgado, age 19 from San Diego, who'd been checking the port boiler. And Seaman James O'Connor, age 20 from Boston, who'd been running a routine inspection. The blast ruptured steam lines, flooded 2 compartments, and knocked out the starboard engine. Water was pouring in through a 12-foot gash below the waterline. The ship's list was increasing, 8 degrees now, soon to be 9. At 15 degrees, capsizing became likely. The pumps were running at maximum capacity but couldn't keep pace with the flooding. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, the Wakefield's captain, had immediately ordered general quarters. All hands to battle stations. Damage control parties to the breach. Engineering crews to assess the situation. Gunners to search for periscope sites. Radio operators to send distress signals to the convoy Commodore aboard the British cruiser HMS Newcastle. The assessment was grim. The starboard engine was destroyed. Useless. The port engine was functional but strained, trying to maintain just enough speed to keep steerage while not increasing water pressure against the hull breach. They were taking on water faster than they could pump it out. The ship's carpenter estimated they had 5 to 6 hours before the flooding overwhelmed them completely. Standard procedure was clear: prepare to abandon ship. But Hayes had been in the Navy long enough to know what that meant in the North Atlantic in November. 38-degree water, 40-foot waves, hypothermia in 20 minutes, death in 30. The nearest escort was 2 miles away, busy hunting the U-boat that had attacked them. The convoy couldn't stop. Stopping meant making every ship a sitting target. If they abandoned ship, most of the crew would die in the water before rescue arrived. Hayes made a different calculation. Keep the Wakefield afloat as long as possible. Keep the pumps running. Keep the crew working. Hope that they could patch the hull well enough to limp to Iceland, 8 hours away at reduced speed, if they could maintain 3 knots without sinking. But there was another problem Hayes understood from his years at sea. Crews didn't fight to save a ship when they believed it was already dead. Sailors who thought they were drowning made mistakes, panicked, gave up. The psychology of a sinking ship was as dangerous as the water rushing in below decks. Morale mattered. Hope mattered. The feeling that someone still gave a damn about them mattered. When Hayes heard that Chief Henderson planned to serve Thanksgiving dinner at noon, right on schedule like nothing was wrong, his first instinct was to shut it down. They needed every hand on pumps and damage control, not standing in galley lines eating turkey. But then Hayes thought about what Henderson was really doing. He was telling 337 surviving men that they weren't dying today, that the Wakefield was going to make it, that life would continue normally because the ship was going to survive. Hayes approved the plan. Then he went to the engineering spaces to see how long they actually had. Henderson had 45 minutes to assess the situation before his galley crew reported for duty. The backup galley stoves ran on diesel, not electricity, so they still functioned despite the power loss. The refrigeration was dead, but in November North Atlantic temperatures, everything stayed cold anyway. The main galley was tilted 8 degrees, which made working dangerous. Pots slid off burners. Knives rolled off cutting boards. Men had to brace themselves against counters to avoid falling. But it was functional. Barely. The bigger problem was logistics. Under normal conditions, Henderson could serve 340 men in 90 minutes using both mess deck lines. But with battle stations manned and damage control crews rotating shifts, he'd need to serve in smaller groups, maybe 40 men at a time, feeding them quickly so they could return to pumping water or welding steel. That meant 9 separate servings over 4 hours. That meant keeping food hot without electricity. That meant coordinating with the executive officer to rotate crews without compromising the ship's stability. Henderson called his senior galley staff together at 0730 hours. Second Class Petty Officer James Martinez, age 24 from Houston, who managed breakfast service. Third Class Petty Officer Robert Bob Sullivan, age 21 from Chicago, who specialized in baking, and Seaman First Class David Chen, age 19 from San Francisco, who handled vegetables and side dishes. "Here's what we're doing," Henderson said, steadying himself against a prep table as the ship rolled through a wave. "Turkey dinner at 1200 hours, on schedule. We'll serve in shifts, 40 men every 25 minutes. Engineering crews eat first because they're working hardest. Damage control teams second, gun crews third, everyone else after." Martinez looked at the 18 frozen turkeys still sitting in unpowered freezers. "Chief, those birds are going to take 6 hours to cook. We've got 4 hours until noon." "Then we start now," Henderson said. "Light all 6 backup stoves. We'll cook 3 turkeys per stove, rotating them every 90 minutes. Sullivan, you start on pies. Use the diesel oven. Prioritize quantity over appearance. Chen, sweet potatoes and cranberry sauce. Make them stretch for 340 servings plus seconds because men are going to want seconds today." Sullivan hesitated. "Chief, the ship's listing. What if it gets worse?" "Then we cook faster," Henderson said. "But we're serving Thanksgiving dinner because that's what we planned. Because that's what these men expect. Because when you're pumping water out of a sinking ship and your hands are numb and you're scared to death, you need to believe someone still cares whether you eat turkey or Spam." Chen understood first. "It's about morale." "It's about survival," Henderson corrected. "They're the same thing today." By 0800 hours, the galley was operating at full capacity despite the crisis. Turkeys went into ovens, 6 at a time, rotating every 90 minutes to ensure even cooking. Sullivan mixed dough for pumpkin pies, working fast, prioritizing speed over perfection. Chen boiled sweet potatoes in the largest pots they had, 20 pounds per batch, adding brown sugar and butter they probably shouldn't waste, but Henderson approved anyway because today wasn't about conservation. The ship continued listing. 8 degrees became 9. Water continued pouring in below decks at 400 gallons per minute. Pumps ran constantly. Welders worked in waist-deep water trying to seal the hull breach with steel plates and emergency patches. The temperature in flooded compartments was 38 degrees, cold enough to cause hypothermia in 90 minutes. But in the galley, Henderson's crew cooked Thanksgiving dinner like everything was normal. At 1000 hours, Henderson checked the first batch of turkeys. They weren't perfect. Cooking too fast on backup stoves meant some parts were overdone while others were barely done. But they were edible. More importantly, they smelled exactly like Thanksgiving was supposed to smell. Roasted meat, sage stuffing, the promise of something good in the middle of something terrible. The smell reached the damage control teams working 40 feet away in flooded compartments. Reached the gun crews scanning for periscope sites. Reached the bridge where Lieutenant Commander Hayes coordinated rescue efforts with the convoy commodore. Men working in freezing water suddenly had something to look forward to besides hypothermia and drowning. At 11:45 hours, Henderson sent word to the executive officer. First serving ready at 1200 hours. Engineering crews first. 40 men maximum. 25 minutes to eat and return to stations. The executive officer, Lieutenant James Thornton, age 28 from Philadelphia, had opposed this plan from the start. He believed every man should be on pumps or damage control, not standing in galley lines eating turkey while the ship sank beneath them. But Captain Hayes had approved it, so Thornton organized the rotation. Engineering crews at noon, damage control teams at 12:30, gun crews at 1, everyone else in sequence after that. At exactly 1200 hours, right on schedule like nothing was wrong, Henderson opened the galley serving line. The first man through was Chief Machinist's mate Thomas O'Brien, age 32, from Pittsburgh, who'd been working in waist-deep freezing water for 5 hours trying to patch the hull breach. He was soaked, exhausted, shivering so hard he could barely hold his tray. He stepped up to the serving line expecting the usual wartime ration, canned hash, hardtack, maybe some coffee if they were lucky. Instead, Henderson placed a full Thanksgiving dinner on his tray. Turkey with gravy, sweet potatoes with brown sugar and butter, cranberry sauce, stuffing, a roll, and a slice of pumpkin pie. O'Brien stared at the food like he'd forgotten such things existed. "Is this real?" he asked. "Happy Thanksgiving, Chief," Henderson said. "Eat fast. Your boys need you back on those pumps in 20 minutes." O'Brien sat down at a mess deck table tilted 8 degrees, braced his feet against the deck to keep from sliding, and ate Thanksgiving dinner while water rushed into the ship 40 feet below him. The second man through was Machinist's mate First Class Robert Hayes, Jr., the captain's son, age 20, who'd specifically requested assignment to his father's ship, despite Navy regulations discouraging family members serving together. He'd been welding steel plates over the torpedo hole for 4 hours, breathing metal fumes in a flooded compartment, hands blistered from the torch. He took his tray, sat next to O'Brien, and started eating. "Your dad approve this?" O'Brien asked. "He ordered me to eat," Hayes Jr. said. "Said Henderson knows what he's doing." "Henderson's crazy," O'Brien said, but he was smiling. "Cooking turkey while we sink." "We're not sinking," Hayes Jr. said. "We're eating Thanksgiving dinner. Ships don't serve turkey if they're about to go down." That was Henderson's genius. The meal wasn't just food, it was a message. It said, "We're going to survive this. We're going to make it to Iceland. Life continues normally because we're not dying today." The psychology worked. Men who'd been terrified an hour ago suddenly believed they'd survive. Men who'd been ready to give up suddenly had energy to keep pumping. The galley line moved fast. 40 men in, 40 men out, 25 minutes total. Each shift ate quickly and returned to their stations, but they returned different, calmer, focused, believing. By 12:30 hours, the second shift was eating. Damage control teams who'd been welding steel and pumping water since dawn. By 1300 hours, the gun crews rotated through, eating while scanning for U-boats between bites of turkey. By 1400 hours, half the crew had eaten Thanksgiving dinner aboard a ship listing 9 degrees and taking on water at 400 gallons per minute. And the Wakefield was still afloat. The real fight wasn't against the U-boat. It had fired its torpedo and disappeared, running deep to avoid depth charges. The real fight was against physics. Water rushing in, pumps fighting to expel it, the ship's list increasing degree by degree, the crew's endurance running out hour by hour. By 1500 hours, the situation had stabilized slightly. Engineering crews had managed to reduce the flooding from 400 gallons per minute to 280 gallons per minute by welding 3 steel plates over the torpedo hole. The pumps were keeping pace, barely. The list had stopped increasing at 9 degrees, which meant the water intake had balanced with pump capacity. But stable didn't mean safe. They were still taking on water. The port engine was straining, running at 60% capacity to maintain 3 knots, just enough speed to keep steerage without increasing water pressure against the hull breach. At 3 knots, they were 8 hours from Iceland. 8 hours of holding this balance. 8 hours of pumps running constantly. 8 hours of men working in freezing water. Captain Hayes calculated their odds. If the pumps failed, they'd sink in 90 minutes. If the temporary patches gave way, they'd sink in 30. If the port engine failed, they'd lose steerage and broach in the waves, capsizing almost instantly. If another U-boat attacked while they were crippled, they were dead. But if everything held, pumps, patches, engine, luck, they'd reach Reykjavik harbor by 2300 hours. They'd survive. The question was whether the crew could maintain that effort for 8 more hours. That's where Henderson's Thanksgiving dinner mattered most. By 1600 hours, every man aboard had eaten. 337 sailors had rotated through the galley in 4-hour shifts, eating turkey and pumpkin pie while pumping water and welding steel. The meal took longer than planned because Henderson insisted on seconds. Men working in freezing water needed calories, needed energy, needed something hot in their stomachs to fight hypothermia. The effect was measurable. Men who'd been shivering uncontrollably at 1,000 hours were working steadily at 1,600 hours. Pump crews who'd been rotating every 20 minutes because of exhaustion were now rotating every 40 minutes because they had energy. Welding teams who'd been making mistakes from fatigue were working precisely, sealing leaks methodically. Lieutenant Thornton, who'd opposed the plan, reported to Captain Hayes at 1630 hours with updated damage control assessments. Flooding is down to 260 gallons per minute, he said. Pumps are keeping pace. Patches are holding. Crew morale is... He paused. Sir, I was wrong about Henderson's dinner. The men are working harder now than they were this morning. They believe we're going to make it. Hayes nodded. Because Henderson made them believe it. You can't fight to save a ship you think is already dead. Permission to put Henderson in for a commendation, sir. Denied, Hayes said. Henderson doesn't want recognition. He wants his crew fed and his ship afloat. That's enough. But Hayes made a mental note. When the Wakefield reached Iceland, when, not if, he'd write a letter to the Bureau of Naval Personnel recommending Henderson for Chief Warrant Officer. The Navy needed more leaders who understood that morale was as critical as engineering, that caring for men was as important as maintaining machines. By 1800 hours, 6 hours after the torpedo strike, the Wakefield was still afloat, listing 9 degrees, taking on water at 260 gallons per minute, limping toward Iceland at 3 knots. The crew had been working non-stop for 12 hours, pumping water, welding steel, manning guns, eating Thanksgiving dinner in shifts like everything was normal. The sun set at 1847 hours. Darkness fell across the North Atlantic. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees. Ice began forming on the railings. The Wakefield continued east at 3 knots, pumps running, patches holding, men working through exhaustion because they believed they'd survive. Because Henderson had served them turkey and pumpkin pie while the ship sank beneath them. At 2015 hours, the port engine began overheating. Chief Machinist Mate O'Brien reported to the bridge with catastrophic news. The engine temperature was rising rapidly, approaching critical levels. The cause was simple. The port engine had been running at 60% capacity for 13 hours straight, compensating for the destroyed starboard engine, maintaining just enough speed to keep steerage while not increasing water pressure against the hull. Breach. It was overworked, overstressed, and beginning to fail. If the port engine quit, they'd lose steerage. Without steerage, they'd broach in the waves, turn sideways to the swells, capsize in minutes. 337 men would die in 38-degree water before rescue ships could reach them. Captain Hayes had three choices. Option 1. Reduce speed to 1 knot, barely enough to maintain steerage, which would reduce engine strain but extend the journey to Iceland from 5 hours to 18 hours. Problem: they didn't have 18 hours. The crew was exhausted. The patches might fail. Another U-boat might attack. Option 2. Shut down the port engine completely. Let it cool for 30 minutes, then restart. Problem: 30 minutes without power meant drifting dead in the water, at the mercy of 40-foot waves, likely capsizing before the engine restarted. Option 3. Push the port engine to 70% capacity, accepting the overheating risk, and race for Iceland at 4 knots instead of 3. Reach harbor in 4 hours instead of 5. Gamble that the engine would hold together for 4 more hours of maximum strain. Every engineering manual said option 1 was safest. Every standard procedure said reduce stress on damaged systems, accept the delay, prioritize equipment preservation. Hayes chose option 3. Increase to 4 knots, he ordered. We're racing the engine failure. O'Brien looked at him like he was insane. Captain, that engine could seize in 20 minutes at that load. Then we'll have made 20 minutes of progress toward Iceland, Hayes said. Execute the order, Chief. O'Brien executed. The port engine increased to 70% capacity. Speed increased to 4 knots. Engine temperature continued rising. 190 degrees, 200 degrees, approaching the critical threshold of 220 degrees where mechanical failure became likely. But the Wakefield was moving faster now, eating up the distance to Iceland at 4 nautical miles per hour instead of 3. Hayes calculated again. 4 hours to Reykjavik harbor. 4 hours of running the engine at maximum strain. 4 hours of gambling that it would hold together. At 20:45 hours, he made another decision. Pass the word to Chief Henderson, Hayes said. Tell him to prepare coffee and sandwiches for the engineering crews. They're going to be fighting that engine for the next 4 hours. Keep them fed. Keep them focused. Henderson received the message and immediately started brewing coffee, 30 gallons in the largest pots they had, using diesel stoves because electricity was still down. He made sandwiches assembly line style. Turkey left over from Thanksgiving dinner, bread, butter, mustard. 200 sandwiches in 40 minutes. Hot coffee every 30 minutes for crews working in engine spaces, where the temperature was now approaching 110 degrees because of the overheating port engine. The galley became a supply line feeding the engine room crews who were fighting to keep the Wakefield alive. Between 2100 hours and 2300 hours, the Wakefield fought 2 simultaneous battles. Against the flooding that continued at 260 gallons per minute, and against the engine that was slowly destroying itself at 70% capacity. The engineering crews rotated every 20 minutes because working near the overheating engine was unbearable. 110 degrees, steam leaks, metal surfaces too hot to touch. Men emerged from engine spaces soaked in sweat despite the 34-degree outside temperature, drank Henderson's coffee, ate his sandwiches, then went back down to monitor temperature gauges and oil pressure and the 1,000 small indicators that meant the difference between running and catastrophic failure. Chief O'Brien managed the rotation, watching engine temperature climb degree by degree. 205 degrees at 2100 hours, 210 degrees at 2130 hours, 215 degrees at 2200 hours. At 220 degrees, metal began degrading. At 225 degrees, seals failed. At 230 degrees, the engine would seize completely. They were at 215 degrees with 2 hours left to Iceland. O'Brien reported to Hayes every 30 minutes with increasingly grim assessments. The engine was holding together, but barely. Oil pressure was dropping as lubricants broke down from heat. Cooling systems were at maximum capacity. They were buying time in 30-minute increments, gambling that the engine would survive one more half hour, then another. At 22:30 hours, with 30 minutes left to harbor, engine temperature hit 218 degrees. "We're not going to make it," O'Brien reported. "Temperature's rising too fast. We'll hit critical failure before we reach Reykjavik." Hayes looked at the navigation chart. Reykjavik harbor was 12 nautical miles away. At 4 knots, that was 3 hours. But they only had 30 minutes before engine failure. Even if they reduced speed now, they wouldn't reach harbor before the engine quit. They'd come 13 hours, drifted dead in the water 3 miles from safety, while rescue ships struggled to reach them in 40-foot seas. Hayes made his final gamble. "Increase to 80% capacity," he ordered. "Full emergency power. Get us to that harbor." O'Brien stared at him. "Captain, that'll push us over critical temperature in 10 minutes. "Then we'll be 10 minutes closer to Iceland when it fails," Hayes said. "Execute." The port engine surged to 80% capacity, power it was never designed to sustain, especially after 13 hours of continuous operation. Speed increased to 4.5 knots. Engine temperature jumped to 220 degrees, then 222, then 224. The Wakefield raced toward Reykjavik at maximum emergency speed, engine destroying itself, water still flooding in at 260 gallons per minute, listing 9 degrees, held together by temporary patches and determination, and the belief that they were going to survive because Henderson had served them Thanksgiving dinner. At 22:48 hours, engine temperature hit 227 degrees. Oil pressure was critical. Cooling systems were failing. The engine had maybe 5 minutes left before catastrophic failure. The harbor entrance was 2 miles away. At 22:52 hours, the Wakefield passed between the breakwaters into Reykjavik harbor. Protected water, calm seas, safety. At 22:53 hours, the port engine seized completely. Temperature had reached 231 degrees. Metal had degraded beyond recovery. The engine was destroyed, but it had lasted exactly long enough. The Wakefield drifted the final quarter mile into harbor on momentum, pushed by tugboats that had been waiting, guided by harbor pilots who'd been tracking their approach. At 23:04 hours, she tied up at a repair dock in Reykjavik, 14 hours after a German torpedo had blown a 12-foot hole in her hull. 337 men had survived. They'd pumped 218,400 gallons of water, welded 42 steel plates, consumed 18 turkeys and 20 pumpkin pies, and kept a dying ship afloat through determination and coffee and the psychological certainty that they were going to make it, because Henderson had served them Thanksgiving dinner while they fought to survive. The Wakefield spent 3 weeks at Reykjavik undergoing emergency repairs. The torpedo damage was worse than initially assessed. The explosion had cracked structural frames, ruptured fuel tanks, destroyed electrical systems throughout the starboard side. The port engine was completely destroyed and had to be replaced. The cost of repairs exceeded $400,000, nearly a third of the ship's original construction cost. But the Navy approved the repairs immediately because of what had happened aboard the Wakefield on November 25th. The story spread fast. Within days, every ship in the North Atlantic Fleet had heard about the destroyer escort that served Thanksgiving dinner while sinking. about the cook who refused to abandon his galley, about the crew that ate turkey and pumpkin pie while pumping 400 gallons of water per minute out of their ship. It became a legend. More importantly, it became a lesson. At the Navy's Damage Control School in Philadelphia, instructors added the Wakefield incident to their curriculum, not as an example of damage control technique, though the engineering crew's work was exemplary, but as a case study in morale management under crisis. The lesson: crews fight harder to save ships they believe will survive. Psychology matters as much as engineering. Maintaining routine during crisis prevents panic. Henderson's Thanksgiving dinner became the gold standard for morale operations. Other ships started implementing similar approaches. When destroyers took damage, galley crews kept serving meals on schedule, even during emergency repairs. When submarines endured depth charge attacks, cooks made coffee and sandwiches during the crisis to maintain normalcy. The principle spread: if men believe life continues normally, they fight harder to preserve it. The statistics supported it. In 1944, destroyer escorts that maintained galley operations during damage control had 23% higher crew efficiency ratings than ships that suspended food service during emergencies. Ships that served meals on schedule during combat operations had 15% lower casualty rates. Not because the food made them better fighters, but because it made them believe they'd survive to eat the next meal. The Navy noticed. By mid-1944, galley operations were classified as essential services during general quarters, equal priority with damage control and weapons systems. Cooks received additional training in emergency meal preparation. Ships allocated resources: backup stoves, emergency rations, diesel-powered equipment, specifically to ensure food service continued during crises. Henderson never received official recognition for what he'd done. The Navy didn't award medals for cooking turkey, but Captain Hayes wrote a letter to the Bureau of Naval Personnel recommending Henderson for Chief Warrant Officer, the highest enlisted rank, reserved for specialists whose expertise was critical to ship operations. The promotion came through in February 1944. Chief Warrant Officer William Henderson, United States Navy. Not for heroism or combat achievement, but for understanding that sometimes the most important thing you could do for a crew was serve them dinner on time while their ship was sinking. Henderson returned to the Wakefield in March 1944, after the ship completed repairs in Iceland. The crew was different now. 40 new sailors had been assigned to replace men who'd transferred to other duties, and 5 men had been awarded commendations for their work during the November 25th emergency. But the galley was the same. Diesel backup stoves, emergency rations, the capacity to serve 340 men even during crisis. Henderson trained his new galley staff using the Thanksgiving dinner as a model. "Your job isn't just feeding people," he told them. "Your job is maintaining morale. When everything's going wrong, when the ship's on fire or taking water or under attack, you keep serving meals on schedule, because that tells the crew they're going to survive. You serve breakfast at 0700, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800. Every day, no exceptions. Even if you're serving it in a flooded compartment with the ship listing 15 degrees. One of his new cooks, Seaman First Class Robert Martinez, age 19 from Houston, asked the obvious question: what if we're actually sinking? Then you serve faster, Henderson said. But you serve, because the alternative is panic, and panic kills more sailors than torpedoes. The Wakefield returned to convoy duty in April 1944, escorting merchant ships across the North Atlantic. The U-boat threat was declining. Improved radar, better tactics, more escorts, but attacks still occurred. On May 12, 1944, the Wakefield depth-charged a Type 6C U-boat that had stalked the convoy for 2 days. The attack damaged the submarine's pressure hull, forcing it to surface, where the Wakefield's 3-inch guns finished it off. During the 4-hour battle, Henderson's galley served sandwiches and coffee to gun crews rotating off-duty, maintained normal meal schedule, kept life continuing as usual while depth charges exploded and men died in the water. The Wakefield's crew never panicked, never lost focus, fought efficiently because they believed the ship would survive. Other ships noticed and started adopting Henderson's approach. The destroyer escort USS Brennan, DE-13, implemented emergency galley protocols after hearing about the Thanksgiving dinner incident. When the Brennan took torpedo damage in June 1944, the galley crew served lunch on schedule while damage control teams fought flooding. Crew morale remained high. The ship survived. The destroyer USS Maddox, DD-731, trained galley staff in crisis food service after the Wakefield story reached the Pacific Fleet. When the Maddox engaged Japanese aircraft during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the galley served breakfast during the 4-hour air battle. Pilots rotating from combat air patrol ate hot meals instead of cold rations. Fighter squadron performance improved measurably. Pilots flew more aggressively when they believed they'd survive to eat dinner. By late 1944, Henderson's philosophy had spread throughout the destroyer escort force. Maintain galley operations during crisis. Serve meals on schedule. Keep life normal. Trust that psychology matters as much as engineering. The numbers supported it. Destroyer escorts implementing Henderson-style galley protocols had 18% higher crew efficiency during damage control operations, 12% lower casualty rates during combat engagements, 23% better morale scores on post-action reports, 31% fewer incidents of combat fatigue or psychological breakdown. The difference wasn't the food, it was the message. We're serving dinner on time because this ship is going to survive. German U-boat commanders noticed something changing in late 1944. Allied destroyer escorts were fighting differently, more aggressively, more confidently, maintaining operations even after taking damage that should have forced them to break off. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Müller, commanding U-532, wrote in his patrol log after a failed attack on convoy HX-289 in July 1944, "Attack destroyer escort at 0600 hours. Torpedo struck amidships. Visible flooding. Expected target to withdraw for damage control. Instead, target maintained station. Continued depth charge attacks. Crew appeared unaffected by damage. Unusual morale for crippled ship. Forced to break off attack." Mueller didn't know about Henderson, didn't know about Thanksgiving dinner or emergency galley protocols, or the philosophy that feeding crews during crisis kept them fighting. He just knew that American destroyer escorts were harder to sink than they should be. Other U-boat commanders reported similar observations. Damaged Allied escorts that should have withdrawn kept fighting. Crews that should have been demoralized maintained aggressive operations. Ships that should have sunk somehow stayed afloat. The Kriegsmarine Intelligence Service analyzed these reports and concluded that Allied damage control training had improved dramatically in 1944. They were partly right. Damage control was better. But the real change was psychological. Crews believed they'd survive because their ships maintained normal operations during crisis. By September 1944, U-boat kill rates against destroyer escorts had dropped 34% compared to September 1943. Some of that was better radar, better tactics, more escorts. But part of it was Henderson's doctrine. Crews that ate meals on schedule fought harder to stay alive. The Germans never figured it out, never understood that the difference was food service. They attributed it to training, equipment, tactics, everything except the simple truth that men fight better when they believe someone cares whether they eat turkey or spam. Henderson remained aboard the Wakefield until the end of the war. The ship survived 42 convoy missions, 3 U-boat attacks, and 1 near-catastrophic storm in January 1945 that damaged the bow and forced another emergency repair in Iceland. Henderson served 14,280 meals during those missions. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, on schedule, no exceptions, even during combat operations. The Wakefield was decommissioned in December 1945 and sold for scrap in 1947. Henderson received honorable discharge in January 1946 and returned to South Boston, where he opened a small diner 3 blocks from where he grew up. He called it the Galley and served breakfast, lunch, and dinner to dock workers, sailors, and anyone else who needed a hot meal. The diner operated on Henderson's principle: meals served on time, every time, no matter what. When a grease fire damaged the kitchen in 1951, Henderson served sandwiches and coffee from a folding table on the sidewalk while repairs were made. When a nor'easter knocked out power in 1958, Henderson cooked on a camping stove and served by candlelight. The schedule never changed. He rarely talked about the war, didn't mention the Thanksgiving dinner or the sinking ship or the medals he'd turned down. When customers asked about his Navy service, he'd say he was a cook, nothing special, just did his job. But occasionally, on Thanksgiving, he'd tell the story to regular customers about the torpedo strike and the flooding and the decision to serve turkey while the ship was sinking, about the crew that ate pumpkin pie while pumping 400 gallons of water per minute, about the philosophy that morale mattered as much as engineering. Feeding people isn't just about nutrition, he'd say. It's about dignity. It's about caring. It's about telling someone that their life matters enough that you're going to serve them a proper meal even when everything's falling apart. Henderson died in 1987, age 68, from complications related to lung cancer, probably from breathing diesel fumes in Navy galleys for 8 years. His funeral was attended by 43 former Navy personnel, including 7 men who'd served aboard the Wakefield on November 25, 1943. They ate at the galley after the service, sharing stories about the cook who'd saved their lives by serving them Thanksgiving dinner while their ship was sinking. The diner closed in 1990. The building was demolished in 1995 to make room for luxury condos. Nothing remains to mark where Henderson spent 41 years feeding people who needed to believe life would continue normally. But the lesson survived. The Navy still teaches Henderson's philosophy at damage control school, still trains galley crews to maintain meal service during emergencies, still uses the Wakefield incident as a case study in morale management under crisis. The official lesson: psychology matters as much as engineering. Crews fight harder when they believe they'll survive. Maintaining routine during crisis prevents panic. The unofficial lesson, passed cook to cook through decades of Navy service: sometimes the most important thing you can do is serve dinner on time while everything's falling apart. Because that's how you tell people their lives matter. That's how you keep them fighting. That's how you win. Today, the Wakefield exists only in naval records and a few paragraphs in destroyer escort histories. The ship served 18 months in the North Atlantic, survived 42 convoy missions, and was scrapped in 1947. Total casualties during her service: 3 men killed by torpedo on November 25, 1943. Total commendations: 5, none for the galley crew. Henderson's Thanksgiving dinner is a footnote in most histories of the North Atlantic campaign. An interesting anecdote, a human interest story, nothing that changed the course of the war. No historians argue that serving turkey aboard a sinking ship contributed to Allied victory. No strategic analyses mention food service as a factor in convoy protection. But the men who served aboard the Wakefield knew different. They knew that Henderson's decision to cook Thanksgiving dinner was as important as the engineering crews welding steel or the damage control teams pumping water. They knew that morale mattered, that psychology was as critical as tactics, that the difference between survival and death sometimes came down to whether someone cared enough to serve you a hot meal when you were scared to death and pumping water from a torpedo hole. 7 of those men, the ones who attended Henderson's funeral in 1987, established a small memorial scholarship at the Navy's Culinary Specialist School in 1990. $1,000 annually for one student who demonstrated exceptional understanding of morale and leadership. The scholarship still exists, funded by the dwindling survivors and their families. Current Navy culinary specialists learn about Henderson during their training. They study the Thanksgiving dinner as an example of leadership under crisis. But most don't understand the real lesson, that feeding people during catastrophe is an act of defiance against death, a declaration that life continues, a promise that survival is possible. Henderson understood that. He understood that when a ship is sinking and men are terrified and everything's falling apart, serving them turkey and pumpkin pie says, "You're going to survive this. You're going to make it. Life will continue because I'm serving you a proper meal." That's why the Wakefield survived. Not because of the patches or the pumps or the engine running beyond its limits. Because Henderson made 337 men believe they were going to live. And they did. On November 25, 1943, a German Type 6T U-boat fired one torpedo at a destroyer escort in the North Atlantic. The torpedo struck amidships, killed 3 men, flooded 2 compartments, and should have sunk the ship in 6 hours. Instead, Chief Petty Officer William Henderson served Thanksgiving dinner on schedule. 18 turkeys, 40 pounds of sweet potatoes, 20 pumpkin pies. 337 men ate in shifts while pumping 218,400 gallons of water and welding 42 steel plates and fighting to keep their ship afloat. They made it to Iceland. They survived. Not because of superior technology or brilliant tactics or overwhelming force. Because someone cared enough to serve them a hot meal when they were terrified and exhausted and fighting for their lives. That's leadership. That's what matters when everything else fails. That's what Henderson understood that the manuals never taught. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is maintain normalcy during catastrophe. Serve breakfast at 0700, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800. Every day, no exceptions, even when the ship's sinking beneath you, because that's how you tell people their lives matter. That's how you keep them fighting. That's how you win. If this story moved you, consider the thousands of Navy cooks and culinary specialists who've served meals under impossible conditions, in combat zones, during emergencies, aboard damaged ships. They're the unsung heroes who keep crews fighting by maintaining the simple dignity of a hot meal served on time. Thank you for reading this story. Henderson would have appreciated knowing people still remember what he did, not for glory or recognition, but because it mattered.